The flames were already inside the stable when she made the decision that would kill her. 14 horses screaming behind wooden walls, her father gone to town, and smoke thick enough to choke on. She had maybe 3 minutes before the whole structure came down. The Montana Territory dawn came cold and gray in September 1878, and 16-year-old Emmy was already awake. She'd learned to move quietly through the ranch house, skipping the 3rd floorboard that creaked, easing the kitchen door shut without a sound. Her father, Jacob, slept upstairs in the room he'd barely left since her mother died 2 years back. The grief had hollowed him out, left him staring at ledgers he couldn't balance and debts he couldn't pay. Emmy wrapped 2 thick slices of bread in a cloth, tucking them inside her worn jacket. Her own stomach growled in protest, but she'd gotten used to that hollow feeling. The horses needed it more. They always did. The stable sat 100 yards from the house, its wood silvered by weather and neglect. Inside, 14 horses stirred at her footsteps, their breath clouding in the chill air. Emmy moved down the line, breaking off pieces of bread, whispering to each animal like they were old friends. Because they were. In the 2 years since her mother passed, these horses had heard every secret, every fear, every prayer Emmy couldn't speak aloud. She saved the last piece for Dust Devil, a scarred gelding in the corner stall. He'd arrived 6 months ago, half-starved and beaten, sold cheap by a freight driver who'd worked him to breaking. Her father couldn't afford another mouth to feed, but Emmy had begged. She'd promised to give up her own meals if necessary. Jacob had relented, too tired to argue. Now Dust Devil pressed his scarred muzzle into Emmy's palm, his dark eyes watching her with something like understanding. She stroked his neck, feeling the ridges where a whip had torn through hair and skin. "You're safe here," she whispered. "I promise you're safe." But even as she spoke the words, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast on the road. Through the stable door, she saw him riding up in the dim light. Silas Hargrave, the land speculator who held the note on their ranch, and he never came this early unless he wanted blood. Emmy slipped into the hayloft before Hargrave could spot her. From the shadows above, she had a clear view of the stable entrance where her father emerged, still buttoning his shirt, his face gray with exhaustion. Hargrave dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he touched, and he touched plenty in Sweetwater Valley. 2 weeks, Jacob," Hargrave said without preamble. His voice carried the smooth threat of a loaded gun. "That's what we agreed last time, 2 weeks to come up with $300 or I file the foreclosure papers." Her father's shoulders sagged. "Silas, please. The cattle prices dropped again. I need another month, maybe 6 weeks. I've got a buyer, interested in some of the stock." "A buyer?" Hargrave laughed, short and cold. "You mean old Crawford, who can barely afford feed for his own animals?" "Jacob, I've been patient. More patient than any businessman should be. But patience doesn't pay my creditors." Emmy pressed herself flat against the hay bales, her heart hammering. $300 might as well have been $3,000. They didn't have $50 between them. "My wife," her father started, his voice breaking. "Sarah always said this land was meant to stay in the family. She made me promise." "Sarah's been dead 2 years." Hargrave's tone softened slightly, but the steel underneath remained. "And promises don't settle accounts. You've got until the end of the month. Not a day more." Emmy watched Hargrave mount his horse and ride off, leaving her father standing alone in the dirt. When the hoofbeats faded, Jacob turned and walked straight into the stable. Emmy climbed down quietly, meaning to leave before he saw her, but she heard the sound that stopped her cold. Her father was crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. She found him leaning against Dust Devil's stall, his face buried in his hands. Emmy had seen her father cry only once before, at her mother's funeral. This was worse somehow. This was a man breaking into pieces with no way to put himself back together. That night, long after her father had fallen into restless sleep, Emmy sat on her bed and opened the small wooden box her mother had left her. Inside was a silver locket, delicate and beautiful, with tiny engravings of wildflowers. Her mother had worn it every day of her life. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Emmy as a baby, one of her parents on their wedding day. Emmy closed her fingers around the locket. She knew a jeweler in Bozeman who bought estate silver. It wouldn't be $300, but it might buy them time. It might buy them hope. She tucked the locket into her pocket and lay back, staring at the ceiling until dawn. The stagecoach to Bozeman left at dawn, and Emmy told her father she was visiting a friend in town. He barely looked up from his coffee, too lost in his own despair to question her. She clutched the locket in her pocket like a lifeline, feeling its weight with every bump in the road. They were 5 miles out when the coach jerked to a sudden stop. The driver cursed loud enough for the passengers to hear. Emmy leaned out the window and saw the problem immediately. A wagon had broken down in the middle of the road, its front wheel shattered. A horse lay tangled in the traces, thrashing wildly, eyes white with panic. A woman in a traveling dress stood beside the wreckage, wringing her hands uselessly. "Please, someone help. She's going to break her legs." The other passengers muttered about delays and schedules. Emmy didn't think. She jumped from the coach and ran straight to the trapped mare. The horse was screaming now, that high-pitched sound of procure that cuts through everything else. Blood streaked her foreleg where the leather had cut deep. "Don't touch her," the woman shouted. "She'll kick your head off." Emmy ignored her. She'd seen panic before, knew the language of it. She approached from the side, speaking low and steady, the same voice she used with Dust Devil. "Easy now. Easy, girl. Nobody's hurting you. I'm going to get you loose." The mare's breathing slowed just a fraction. Emmy kept talking, kept her movements deliberate and calm. She worked the buckles with steady hands, feeling the horse tremble beneath her touch. When the last strap came free, the mare lurched to her feet, stumbling but standing. Emmy checked the leg, bleeding, but not broken. "How did you do that?" The woman stared at her like she'd just witnessed magic. "I've been trying for 20 minutes. Horses remember kindness when people forget," Emmy said, the words automatic, her mother's words. She just needed to know she was safe. The woman grabbed Emmy's hands, her eyes bright with tears. "I'm Adelaide Walsh. I'm a photographer traveling to document the territory. That mare is everything to me. Please let me repay you somehow." "I don't need payment." "Then at least let me give you something." Adelaide pulled a card from her bag, pressing it into Emmy's palm. "My address in Bozeman. If you ever need help, anything at all, you find me. I mean it." Emmy pocketed the card without looking at it and climbed back onto the coach. She didn't tell Adelaide that help wouldn't save them now. That the only thing that might was pressed against her heart in a silver locket that had already broken it to carry. The jeweler in Bozeman was a thin man with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling size. He turned the locket over in his pale fingers, examining the engravings with professional detachment. Emmy stood across the counter, her nails digging into her palms. $40, he said finally, setting it down. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. 40, but it's pure silver, the craftsmanship alone. "Miss, I buy 10 of these a week. Widows, daughters, desperate folks selling their memories. The market's flooded." He pushed the locket back toward her. 40 is generous." Emmy stared at the small piece of silver that held her mother's face, her history, everything that connected her to a life before grief and debt. $40 wouldn't even cover a month's interest on what they owed. It was nothing. It changed nothing. She took the money. The ride home felt longer than the journey out. Emmy watched the sun drop toward the mountains, turning the sky blood red, and felt something inside her chest crack apart. She'd sold her mother's memory for a handful of coins that wouldn't save anyone. Her father was in the barn when she arrived, and she knew immediately something terrible had happened. He stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid, staring at the wall like it held answers written in the wood. Grain. Papa, I made a deal. His voice came out flat, dead. Talk to Carson, the freight hauler. He's buying 7 horses, taking them day after tomorrow. Emmy's blood went cold. Which 7? Jacob finally turned. His eyes were hollow. Whatever he picks, he's paying fair market, which is more than we'd get at auction after Hargrave forecloses. It's the only way to keep the ranch. Dust Devil. Emmy's throat closed around the words. He'll take Dust Devil. You know he will. He'll work him to death on those freight routes. Then Dust Devil dies on a freight route instead of us losing everything. Her father's voice cracked like a whip. You think I want this? You think I don't know what happens to those horses? But better some of them suffer than we lose it all. Your mother's land, her grave, everything she built here. Emmy felt tears burning hot down her face. Mama would never... Your mother's dead. The words hit like a physical blow. And I'm trying to keep us alive. That's what matters now. Survival. He walked past her and into the house, leaving Emmy alone in the darkening barn. She looked at the $40 clutched in her hand, then at the stable where 14 horses waited, trusting and innocent. She'd promised Dust Devil he was safe. She'd looked into his scarred, gentle eyes and given him her word. And in 2 days, she was going to break it. Emmy couldn't sleep that night or the next. She spent the hours before dawn in the stable, feeding Dust Devil every scrap of food she could spare, whispering apologies he couldn't understand. Carson would arrive tomorrow. The clock was running out. On the 3rd morning, she woke to heat. Unusual heat for September. The kind that made the air shimmer and turned the grass brittle as paper. Her father had ridden into town at first light to finalize the sale paperwork. Emmy worked the southern pasture alone, mending fence posts, trying not to think about tomorrow. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Her head snapped up. A thin gray column rose from the direction of the ranch buildings, growing thicker even as she watched. Emmy dropped her tools and ran for her horse, her heart slamming against her ribs. The ride back felt endless, every second stretching like taffy. She crested the hill and saw hell itself. The old hay barn was engulfed, flames leaping 30 feet into the air. Black smoke poured from every opening, carried by wind that pushed the fire directly toward the stable. Ranch hands ran in chaos, forming a bucket line from the well, but the water was nothing against that inferno. The heat hit Emmy's face like a wall. How did it start? She screamed at Will, the oldest farmhand. Hargrave's man was here this morning. Will's face was streaked with soot. Inspecting the property, smoking a cigar, must have tossed it in the hay. By the time we smelled it, the whole barn was going up. Emmy's eyes locked on the stable. Smoke was already seeping through gaps in the wood. Inside, horses screamed. Not the normal sounds of animals, but the high-pitched shrieks of pure terror. 14 horses trapped in wooden stalls with fire racing toward them. We can't get them out. Another hand grabbed her arm. The main door's too close to the fire. The heat alone will cook us. Emmy watched a shower of sparks land on the stable roof. The old shingles began to smoke. She had minutes, maybe less. Her father wasn't here. Carson wasn't here. Nobody was coming to save those horses except her. She thought about Dust Devil in his corner stall, the scars on his neck from the last time humans hurt him. She thought about her mother's voice. Horses remember kindness when people forget. She thought about promises made in the dark to animals who trusted her with everything they had. Emmy ran to the water trough and dunked her head, soaking her hair and clothes. She grabbed a blanket, drenched it, wrapped it around her shoulders. The ranch hands were yelling, reaching for her, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. She ran straight into the burning stable. The smoke hit Emmy like a fist. Thick, black, choking. She couldn't see 3 feet ahead. The wet blanket over her head helped, but barely. Heat pressed against her skin, baking through her soaked clothes. Above, The ceiling groaned like a dying animal. The horses were screaming. Emmy moved by sound and memory, throwing open the first stall. A bay mare bolted past her toward the door, nearly knocking her down. Second stall, third. She slapped flanks and shouted, driving them toward the rectangle of daylight that marked escape. Some ran, others froze, paralyzed by terror. Emmy grabbed a frozen gelding by the mane and physically hauled him forward. "Move, now!" Her voice came out raw, shredded by smoke. The horse finally lurched into motion. She counted as they fled past her. 6, 7, 8. The smoke was getting worse, turning the air to poison. Emmy's lungs burned with every breath. She could feel blisters rising on her exposed skin. Ninth stall, Dust Devil. He stood rigid in the corner, eyes rolling white, every muscle locked tight. Emmy recognized that paralysis. She'd seen it the day he arrived, beaten and starving. This was trauma deeper than fire, the kind that breaks something inside and leaves it broken. "Devil, please," Emmy's voice cracked. "You have to trust me." He didn't move. A beam crashed behind her, sending up a fountain of sparks. The ceiling was coming down. Emmy wrapped her arms around Dust Devil's neck, pressing her face against his scarred hide. "I won't leave you. You hear me? I won't leave you." She felt it then, the smallest shift. His breathing changed. His rigid muscles relaxed a fraction. Emmy kept talking, kept touching him, even as the heat grew unbearable and the smoke turned the world to darkness. She wrapped the wet blanket around his head and pulled. He took one step, then another. They stumbled together through the inferno. Emmy's hand twisted in his, mane guiding him toward air and light. They burst through the stable door as a section of roof collapsed behind them. 10 horses stood in the far pasture, wild-eyed but alive. Emmy counted them twice through streaming eyes. 10. But there were 14 stalls, 4 horses still inside. Will grabbed her as she turned back toward the stable. "No, Emmy, it's coming down. You can't." She twisted free and ran. Behind her, she heard him shouting for help, but the words were lost in the roar of flames. Emmy ducked back through the door, back into hell, the wet blanket already steaming on her shoulders. The far stalls held the last 4 horses, the pregnant mare, the young colt, 2 others she'd fed bread to every morning for years. The ceiling was a sheet of fire now, dropping burning debris like rain. Emmy couldn't breathe anymore. Each gasp pulled fire into her lungs. The blanket on her shoulders had dried out, starting to smoke. She could smell her own hair burning, but she kept moving, kept opening stalls. The 2 geldings from the middle stalls bolted the moment she freed them. Driven mad by terror, they crashed toward the main entrance, disappearing into smoke and flame. Emmy prayed they made it. That left 2. The pregnant mare and her colt in the back corner. Emmy stumbled toward them, her vision blurring. The mare was pressed against the far wall, the colt tucked behind her, both trembling. Emmy got the stall door open, but they wouldn't budge. Fire blocked the main entrance now, a solid wall of orange and red. Even if she could get them moving, there was nowhere to go. Then she saw it. The back wall, weakened by fire, had a gap where the old door used to be. It was blocked by a fallen support post burning at both ends, but beyond it was open air, freedom, life. Emmy looked at the post, looked at the horses, did the math that had only one answer. She wedged her shoulder under the burning wood and pushed. Pain exploded through her body, worse than anything she'd ever felt. The smell of her own burning flesh filled her nose. She screamed, pushing harder, every nerve ending on fire. The post shifted an inch, 2 inches. "Go!" Emmy's voice was barely human. "Go now!" The mare sensed the opening. She lunged forward, shoving past Emmy, the colt scrambling after her. They squeezed through the gap just as Emmy's legs gave out. She collapsed, the burning post pinning her shoulder. Above, the ceiling made a sound like the earth splitting open. Emmy tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. Smoke filled her vision, turning everything gray. She thought about her mother, about promises kept and broken. She thought about Dust Devil's scarred neck and the trust it took for him to follow her through fire. She thought about 14 horses, safe now in the pasture, alive because she'd refused to leave them. The weight lifted suddenly. Hands grabbed her, dragging her backward. Will and 2 other ranch hands pulled her through the gap in the wall just as the entire structure collapsed inward with a roar that shook the ground. Emmy lay in the dirt, staring up at the sky. It was blue, impossibly blue, and she couldn't remember ever seeing anything more beautiful. Someone was talking to her, urgent voices, but the words wouldn't form into meaning. She turned her head and saw them. 14 horses in the far pasture, every single one. Dust Devil stood at the fence line watching her, and Emmy tried to smile. They were safe. All of them. That was all that mattered. Emmy couldn't feel her legs. Someone was wrapping blankets around her, but the cold came from somewhere deeper, spreading through her chest like frost. Voices floated above her, panicked and distant. She kept trying to tell them the horses were safe, but her mouth wouldn't form the words. Then her father was there, his face appearing above her like a ghost. His lips moved, saying her name over and over, but she couldn't hear him properly. Everything sounded like it was underwater. Jacob's hands shook as he touched her face, her hair, like he was trying to make sure she was real. They carried her to the house. Emmy saw Adelaide Walsh standing near the fence, a camera in her hands, tears streaming down her face. The photographer must have been nearby, documenting homesteads like she'd said. Emmy wanted to thank her for the card, even though she'd never needed to use it. Funny how things worked out. The doctor came from town, a gray-haired man who smelled like tobacco and carbolic acid. Emmy watched him work through a haze of pain, saw him shake his head when he thought she wasn't looking. Her father stood in the corner, holding himself like he might fall apart if he moved. The burns covered her shoulder and back, the doctor explained. 3rd degree, he called them. The smoke damage to her lungs was severe. There were medicines, treatments, but his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this before, who knew how it ended. "Papa," Emmy's voice came out as a whisper. "The horses." Jacob dropped to his knees beside her bed, taking her hand carefully like she was made of glass. "All 14, baby girl, every single one. You got them all out." Emmy smiled. It hurt, but she smiled anyway. "Devil too?" "Devil's fine. He's standing at the fence, won't leave. Keeps looking at the house like he's waiting for you." "He remembers." Emmy's eyes were getting heavy. "Horses remember kindness." "Emmy, please." Her father's voice broke. "Stay with me. You're all I have left." "I kept my promise." She squeezed his hand, feeling how small and weak her own fingers had become. "I told him he was safe. I meant it." The room was getting darker, or maybe her eyes were just closing. Emmy felt her mother's presence then, warm and real, like she was standing right there in the corner. She looked young again, healthy, wearing the silver locket that Emmy had sold for 40 useless dollars. "They're all safe," Emmy whispered one last time. "Papa, they're all safe." Jacob held his daughter's hand and felt it go still. 3 hours after she'd run into burning building the first time, Emmeline Thorne died keeping promises to animals who couldn't speak but understood everything. The funeral drew people from 50 miles in every direction. Ranch hands who'd worked with Emmy, townspeople who'd watched her grow up, families who'd never met her but heard what she'd done. They came in wagons and on horseback, wearing their Sunday clothes, carrying flowers picked from September gardens already touched by frost. Jacob stood at the graveside next to his wife's marker, his face carved from stone. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words since Emmy died, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. He just sat in her room holding the $40 she'd gotten for her mother's locket, the money she'd tried to save them with. The preacher spoke about sacrifice and courage, about love that gives everything and asks nothing back. His words were good words, true words, but they felt small against the weight of what had been lost. Then Silas Hargrave arrived. The crowd parted as he walked through, and the silence that followed him was heavy with judgment. He stopped at the grave, holding his hat in both hands. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the fresh-turned earth. "I'm sorry, Jacob." Hargrave's voice was barely audible. "The fire started because of my man's carelessness. Your daughter died because of me." He reached into his coat and pulled out papers. The loan documents, every page that bound Jacob to debt and desperation. Hargrave tore them in half, then tore them again, letting the pieces fall onto Emmy's grave like snow. "The debt is forgiven, all of it." Hargrave looked at Jacob with eyes that carried their own kind of pain. "It won't bring her back. Nothing will. But at least she didn't die for nothing." He walked away before anyone could respond. Adelaide Walsh was there too, standing apart from the crowd. She'd brought the photograph she'd taken, the image she'd captured in Emmy's final moments. It showed the ranch hands carrying Emmy from the wreckage, her body broken, but her face peaceful. And behind her, Dust Devil followed, his scarred head lowered, refusing to leave her side. "This picture is going to newspapers across the territory," Adelaide said quietly to Jacob. "People need to know what she did, what she was." After the service, something unexpected happened. Ranchers started approaching Jacob one by one. They brought horses, not their worst animals or their oldest, but good stock, healthy and strong. Each man said the same thing, with slight variations: for the ranch, to replace what was lost. By sunset, 20 new horses grazed in the pasture alongside the 14 Emmy had saved. Jacob stood at the fence, watching them, and finally let himself cry. Not the broken sobs from before, but something quieter, something that might eventually turn into healing. Winter came to Sweetwater Valley, blanketing the ranch in snow that made everything look clean and new. Jacob Thorne stood in the stable at dawn, just like his daughter used to, carrying bread wrapped in cloth. The horses stirred at his footsteps, their breath clouding in the cold air. He moved down the line, breaking off pieces, speaking quietly to each animal. It felt strange at first, talking to horses like they could understand, but then he'd see the way they turned their heads toward his voice, the way they pressed their noses into his palm, and he realized Emmy had been right all along. They did understand. Maybe better than people. He saved the last piece for Dust Devil. The scarred gelding waited in his corner stall, the same one he'd occupied since arriving half-starved and beaten. Jacob had gotten offers to buy him, good money from good people, but he'd refused everyone. Dust Devil stayed. That wasn't negotiable. "She loved you, you know." Jacob stroked the horse's neck, feeling the ridges where whips had torn through skin. "Probably more than she loved most people." Dust Devil nickered softly, and Jacob could have sworn the animal was answering. Adelaide's photograph had spread across Montana territory and beyond. Newspapers from San Francisco to Chicago ran the story of the girl who died saving horses from fire. Letters arrived weekly from strangers, people who'd been moved by Emmy's sacrifice, who wanted to know more about her life. Jacob had taken down the old ranch sign and carved a new one. "Emmy's Promise," it read in simple letters. Visitors came sometimes, wanting to see where it happened, to hear the story firsthand. Jacob told it, over and over, until the pain of speaking her name became something he could carry. Carson, the freight hauler, never came for his horses. Word got around about what Emmy had done, and the man quietly tore up his own contracts. Nobody wanted to be the person who took horses from the ranch where a girl had died protecting them. The ranch began to thrive. More horses arrived as gifts, then as purchases when people learned Jacob wouldn't sell them to just anyone. He interviewed potential buyers like they were adopting children, making sure they understood what Emmy had believed, that horses deserved kindness, that they remembered everything, that promises made to them were sacred. Spring came, and with it new foals in the pasture. Life continuing, the way it always did. Jacob stood at his daughter's grave one morning, watching the sun rise over land that would stay in their family now, land that Emmy had died protecting. "You kept your promises," he said to the marker, "and I'm going to keep mine to you." He walked back to the stable where 14 horses and all their children waited, trusting and gentle, living proof that kindness remembered is kindness that never dies. If Emmy's story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we're bringing you another incredible true story of courage that'll leave you speechless. You won't want to miss it.